All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to ARE Discussions. I'm Ellen Bruno. I'm a cooperative extension specialist in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at UC Berkeley. Thank you all for joining this morning. So ARE Discussions is a webinar series that's open to everyone. We host experts to discuss various pressing economic issues that are relevant for California's agricultural and natural resource communities. This series is being organized by the four UC Cooperative Extension Specialists in Agricultural and Resource Economics. Brittany Goodrich and Tina Saitone are at UC Davis, and Mehdi Namadi is at UC Riverside. Our meeting will run for an hour and 15 minutes. We're going to have Q&A with each of our speakers, and then we'll do Q&A with the audience at the end. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And then, Mehdi will field the Q&A with our speakers at the end. Our webinars are being recorded and they'll be available on our website to view after the webinar. Our website is arediscussions.ucdavis.edu. So today we are joined by two excellent speakers to talk about California's agricultural labor market. We have Dr. Diane Charlton, who is an assistant professor at Montana State University, and we have Dr. Phil Martin, who is a professor emeritus from UC Davis Ag Econ Department. Both of them are experts in issues of immigration and farm labor, and we're delighted to have you both join us today. So I'm going to pass it off to Tina to kick off the first part with Phil.
Thanks so much, Ellen, and thank you, Dr. Martin and Dr. Charlton, for joining us today on ARE Discussions. Dr. Martin certainly worked on labor issues in California and the U.S. and internationally for his whole career, and so I'd like to set up the discussion today with him by asking him just one simple overarching question, which is, how has COVID affected agricultural labor markets?
Okay, thank you, Tina, and thank you, Ellen and everyone, Diane, everybody's here. I'll just start and run through this in about 15 or 20 minutes. COVID, of course, affected a lot of things. We can start with the fact that COVID reduced employment in California agriculture. So the figure's a little hard to read, but black was 2018, yellow was 2019, red is 2020, and black, the second black, sorry, is 2021. And what the basic punchline is that ag employment went down between 2019 and 2020, and it's going down again. We only have the first couple of months of 2021. It's going down again, not going down a lot, but nonetheless going down. So the highlights that you all know already are that COVID changed both the demand and supply for labor-intensive fruits and vegetables. I mean, the demand changes a lot had to do with closed restaurants and food service. And where you saw the biggest effect was in fewer acres of fresh vegetables, because most perennials were still harvested. There was some argument about wine, but that's partly oversupply and partly smoke. And in the surveys of workers, there were many more reports of workers not getting enough hours rather than farm labor shortages. Lots of predictions of farm labor shortages that by and large didn't come true. And then how does this affect California? Well, California, you know, is the great 1/8. We're 1/8 of the population. We're 1/8 of the GDP, roughly. We're 1/8 of agriculture. But the agriculture in California is different because unlike US agriculture, which is roughly 50-50 crops and livestock, we're heavily crops, 3/4 crops and 1/4 livestock. And then our crops are different from the crops in the Midwest in the sense that most of them are fruits and vegetables and horticultural specialties. And that's why the state has about 1/3 of all the hired farm workers in the United States. And as I already mentioned, the big shift in California has been a shift from farmers hiring workers directly and instead hiring workers through what are called crop support services. And so crop support services are essentially non-farm employers who bring workers to farms. And it's like fertilizer application companies, it's custom combining, but the biggest segment is farm labor contractors. And those crop support services wind up being the shock absorbers in the labor market. When there's a need for more labor, you turn to a labor contractor to get more workers. When you don't need as many, you don't hire as many. And the labor contractors turned out to be the shock absorbers for COVID. You see that in their employment going down and in the wages that were paid by labor contract. Wages went up for everybody in agriculture in 2020, but they went up fastest for labor contractors. But the big things that COVID did were they accelerated trends already underway. And this is true in the non-farm economy as well. And the big three trends underway in agriculture are more mechanization, more H2A workers, and more imports. So if you run through it, I mean, COVID changed agriculture by adding masks and social distancing, but there were already a lot of things being done for food safety reasons before COVID. So while there were changes, there were perhaps fewer changes in at least crop agriculture, outdoor crop agriculture, than in some other sectors. I think the big surprise was I too was part of an article that predicted there would be labor shortages because farm workers often live in multi-generational households. They're poor, they may not get tested. That by and large didn't happen. If you actually look at what farmers said, most of them said they did not lose work days due to COVID sickness. And if you look at production, after all, workers are out in the fields harvesting crops. If you look at production, well, some are up and some are down. The largest ones, like lettuce, is the largest vegetable by weight, and its production was up. So by and large, the expectations that COVID was going to spread through the hired farm workforce and lead to labor shortages, which in turn would lead to shortages of fruits and vegetables, did not come true. And that's true whether if you look at strawberries, we actually had higher shipments in the last couple of years than we did a decade ago. And if you just look at 2020 and 21, table grape shipments were pretty much the same as they were before the pandemic. Of course, the big impact in the food system was not in the fields, but it was in meat packing and food processing, where you have a lot of workers close together in often cold and wet environments. And so there, it's really clear that we have about 500,000 people employed in meatpacking, and we had at least 10% contracting COVID, and in some plants, it was over half of the workers in a particular plant that got COVID. We had the same thing in California. We had COVID, especially with the poultry processing, and there was some nut processing and meat packing. But when you read about COVID and farm workers, most of the media reports did not distinguish between farm and non-farm workers. So technically, the people in poultry processing, nut processing, meat packing are non-farm workers, not farm workers. They often have many of the same characteristics of hired farm workers, but they are non-farm rather than farm workers. There's a lot of arguments about exactly why we didn't get as much COVID in the fruit and vegetable workforce as was expected. Probably a lot of it is the fact that the work is done outdoors. I don't know how much effect. There were some outbreaks among H2A workers in motels, et cetera. But I think the big surprise was the predictions of sickness and labor shortages that didn't happen. So California, as I said, is the big farm labor state, and it plays an outside role, especially among crop workers. So it's roughly, there's different ways of calculating average farm employment. But California's is roughly a third of US crop workers and about 10% of livestock workers. Texas is the one that's just slightly bigger. And what has been happening is that over the last decade or so, more workers have been brought to California farms by these crop support, these non-farm employers, than were hired directly. So the orange line is workers brought to farms by crop support services. And remember, most of that is labor contracting. And the yellow line are workers hired directly by crop farms. And that gap was getting wider. It diverged a bit in 2020. And the reason for that was that as the crop support services, especially the labor contractors, they're the shock absorbers. So when we needed fewer workers in 2020, it was not calling in the farm labor contractors. Wages went up quite a bit. This is from a USDA survey, and it applies only to workers who are hired directly by farmers, not to those brought to farms by the crop support services. And you can see that in California, the wages went up faster than they did in the US as a whole, or in our neighboring Oregon and Washington. The better way, the more comprehensive measure, is to look at weekly wages. So on average, what does a hired worker earn in a week? And crop workers who are hired directly earn about $800 a week on average. Those who are brought to farms by labor contractors earn about $600 a week. But the wages went up fastest for those who are hired by labor contractors. So the overall story on kind of demand or employment is that employment shrank slightly, but wages went up quite a bit. What about the workers? Well, the workforce is an aging workforce. It's roughly speaking across the United States, 70% of hired workers were born in Mexico, and 70% of workers born in Mexico are unauthorized. And so 0.7, half of all crop workers are unauthorized. California has a higher share of unauthorized because 90% of our workers were born in Mexico. And these Mexican-born workers are aging. Most of them have US-born children. Those US-born children educated in the United States are not following their parents into the fields. The workers who are now in their 40s, many of them say they would like to continue working agriculture. One reason is many have relatively low levels of education and don't speak English. One issue is going to be whether or not they're going to be able to continue working in agriculture in their 50s and 60s, or whether they're going to be replaced by younger H-2A guest workers. The big story in California has been rising labor costs. And it's not just minimum wages, it's also the fact that overtime requirements are kicking in, and next year will be at 840 like everything else, that there's been some changes. If you pay piece rate workers, they have to earn during their breaks their average piece rate earnings, which means more calculations of exactly what people earn. And what that all adds up to is the combination of an aging workforce that's not being replaced by new unauthorized workers or by the children of current farm workers, and rising labor costs due to minimum wages, as well as other regulatory changes, means that COVID speeded up these three things that were already happening before the pandemic hit. One was labor-saving mechanization, second was H-2A workers, and third is imports, especially from Mexico. The big story with mechanization is that it's the story of agriculture. I mean, for the last 10,000 years, we've been figuring out how to produce, how to replace human labor with machines. And the big news story is trying to do it with essentially some kind of an automation that requires ever fewer humans and much more technology. A lot of commodities have had their harvest. Harvest is normally the most labor-intensive task, and a lot of the harvest really have been mechanized. But the real challenge in agriculture is that much of the robotics work is funded by the military. And in the military, the mindset is we want high performance. It doesn't really matter. I mean, costs matter, but not as much. But in agriculture, you really want low cost and durability, and performance isn't quite as important. You're not going to ever get 100% of the apples off the tree, but the machine has to be durable and it can't be too expensive. So the first big trend is mechanization. A lot of investment is going into it, but for the most part, the progress is relatively slow because of conditions in fields that are very difficult for machines to anticipate. The second thing, of course, is more H2A workers. So H2A workers this year will fill about 1/6 of the full-time equivalent jobs in US crop agriculture, a lower share in California. And we're not yet at Bracero levels. Braceros in the mid-50s were 20%. So if current trends continue, we'll probably be at Bracero era levels of Mexican guest workers by 2025. In order to hire an H2A worker, you have to pay an adverse effect wage rate, and they vary by region. They're lowest in the Southeast, and that's where H2A workers are concentrated. They're highest on the West Coast and in the Midwest. And in the Midwest, that reflects Canadian combining crews that come down with their equipment workers, start in the South, and combine wheat and other grains on the way north. The workers who come in with H2A contracts are in the US for an average of 6 months. And the value of their contracts depends on how long they work here and what the adverse effect wage rate is for that state. So California, for example, has an adverse effect wage rate that's higher than in Florida. And California growers tend to hire H2A workers for more weeks than Florida growers do. So the value of a contract in California is higher than the value of a contract in Florida. The adverse effect wage rates go up and down. It's measured by what farm employers tell USDA they're paying to their directly hired workers. But one of the big issues in the H2A program has been relatively big increases from year to year in particular states, so that when you get like a 15 or a 20% AWR increase in 1 year, then that tends to produce a lot of anti-reaction from farm employers to say their costs have gone up an awful lot. But a big issue is the interaction of H2A workers and local workers. So in order to hire an H2A worker, you have to pay the AWR, this adverse effect wage rate, but you also have to provide free inspected housing. So about a quarter of California H2A workers are in Monterey County, and that's a relatively high cost of living county. So that a local worker who's earning a little more than the minimum wage, who works full time, can wind up giving 3/4 of his or her earnings for rent. Whereas an H2A worker gets free employer-provided housing. Oftentimes, you go into a low-end motel, take out the bedding, put in 4-bunk bed or 2-bunk beds or so for 4 people, and that will house the workers. So there is sometimes tension between young workers who are in California for 6 months who get free housing and local workers who have to pay for housing. The big change in the H2A program has been the expansion in the West Coast. So this has traditionally been a program that provided legal workers for East Coast farmers, originally Florida sugarcane and New England apples, and now Florida citrus and Georgia vegetables, fruits and vegetables, North Carolina vegetables, but the growth has been in California and Washington. And since California and Washington together are about 40% of US crop workers, that's where the potential for the program to grow is greatest. There's a lot of arguments about are H2As, too expensive, too cheap? They are more expensive on a per hour basis. But there are, of course, some differences. H2A workers tend to be younger, at least a decade younger. And the normal way in which H2A workers are recruited is that you have good workers in the crew, and they bring in new workers and actually do the training of the new workers. Among US workers, of course, workers want to maximize their earnings, and so they will change employers to earn more. So the strawberry grower down the road is paying 5 or 10 cents a tray more, I might switch over there. And of course, US workers often carpool to work. So sometimes, especially in strawberry crews or in berry crews, you're going to see 30-year-old workers and 60-year-old workers, and they're both there, even if the 60-year-olds can only earn the minimum wage at the piece rate because they carpool together. So there's a certain labor insurance aspect to H-2A workers because they're tied to a particular employer by a contract. If you're looking at piece rate workers, so picking bins or trays, they tend to be about 20% more productive, in part because they're a lot younger and they tend to be willing to work extra hours. So what people do is weigh the trade-offs of the travel cost, the housing cost, versus the higher productivity and the labor insurance aspect. So the third and final big change that COVID accelerated was imports. So we already import 60% of our fresh fruit and about 35% of our fresh vegetables, and most of it comes from Mexico, half of the fresh fruit imports and 3/4 of the fresh vegetable imports. And if we look at Mexico, there are about 3 million hired farm workers in Mexico, and a third of them, 1 million of them, work on Mexican farms that almost exclusively export to the United States. So 1 out of 3 hired workers in Mexican agriculture is working on a farm that is producing for American consumers. In the United States, we have about 2 million Mexican-born farm workers, and there's about 3 million Mexican-born farm workers in Mexico. But if you add the 1 million on Mexican export farms to the 2 million here, that's 3 million who are producing for the US. The big 3 Mexican exports are tomatoes, avocados, and berries. And the fastest growth has been in tomatoes. Mexico has become the world's #1 tomato exporter. 60% of US fresh tomatoes are imported, and almost all of them are from Mexico, a few from Canadian greenhouses. But the big growth has been in berries. So complicated diagram, but basically if we look at the y-axis, that is the share from Mexico. And so you can see bananas, which is the biggest fruit by volume in the lower left corner, huge volume, but we don't get very many bananas from Mexico. But if you start looking where the yellow arrow is at 100%, you'll see almost all the limes and strawberries and avocados and blackberries and raspberries come from Mexico. And if you look at the x-axis, that's the growth in imports from Mexico. And you can see something like raspberries has had huge growth in production from Mexico. And we're likely to see that continue as the overtime regulations kick in the United States and as our minimum wage keeps going up. In general, a worker in Mexico working in agriculture is going to earn $10 to $15 a day, and that's about 1/10 of what the US wage for farm workers is. California agriculture has traditionally been free trade oriented. And what that means is that Florida, which got its start in fruits and vegetables after the Cuban embargo in the 1960s, has long been protectionist because it competes directly with imports from Mexico. And you all know about the tomato wars, and they're increasingly becoming the blueberry wars and other things. There are underway now something like 4 or 5 US ITC investigations as to whether Mexico is dumping particular commodities into the US market. So the US ITC just concluded no on raspberries and blueberries, but there's new ones going on. And one of the new questions that is being asked because of USMCA is whether Mexican export farms are using child labor and forced labor. You may have seen in the news that the US just decided to block some tomatoes from several farms under the argument that they were using child or forced laborers to produce the tomatoes. But what may happen is, as imports keep accelerating, California could get more protectionist. So to sum it all up, we had a lot of farm labor abundance, which roughly ended with the 2008-09 recession. Now we're in a transition in this decade, and it's kind of a race between machines, both machines to substitute for workers and to make workers more productive, between migrants, especially H-2A guest workers, and imports, where you're importing the labor and the commodity. And it's clearly what's going to happen is whether the outcome is machines, migrants, or imports is going to vary by commodity and a whole lot of other factors. So, for example, something like raisin grapes will probably continue shrinking because imports will take an ever greater share, whereas something like blueberries, for which there are machines that exist, the machines will probably get better, and we could wind up seeing machines substituting for workers. So that's it. If you want more, I usually mention the California Agriculture, which has many of the presenters here, many of the people from the 3 campuses at Berkeley, Riverside, and Davis has contributions. We try to follow some of this in rural migration news as well. So let me stop sharing, and we will, I assume we're putting off questions until after Diane has done hers.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. That was great. A great overview to transition to Dr. Charlton, who is going to talk about one of her papers more specifically. So we kind of did the big picture overview, and now we're going to a specific study. So welcome, Diane. And so we're talking about a paper that she recently got published in the Journal of Applied Economic Perspectives and Policy. And so her paper it looked at the association between monthly farm employment and new COVID cases and deaths within counties across the US. So Diane, I want to just start off broadly by asking sort of what relationships you measured in this specific research, and why should the ag industry and consumers be interested in this problem that you address?
Thanks, Diane. Thanks for the introduction. I think it looks like my internet might be a little bit unstable here, so if there's a problem hearing me, just let me know. So I'm trying to, or I did measure the association between month-to-month changes in historical farm employment, specifically fruit, vegetable, and horticultural employment, and new COVID-19 cases. So why might there be a positive association between seasonal farm employment and COVID-19? And Phil already mentioned some of these factors, but it's essential work that can't be performed remotely. Farm workers and their families often live below the poverty line, often reside in dense living quarters and lack access to health care and health insurance. And an estimated 81% of farm workers in the 2016 National Agricultural Workers Survey were of Hispanic descent, not including H-2A workers who are not in that survey. And there is evidence that the Hispanics tend to be more prone to getting COVID and getting severe cases of COVID. So for example, in California, there are 1,740.3 COVID-19 cases for every 100,000 Latino residents in August, compared to just 514.3 cases per 100,000 white residents. So ex ante, there are some factors that might lead us to suspect that there could be a positive relationship between seasonal farm labor and COVID-19 cases. So what this paper does is it measures the association between month-to-month changes in historical fruit, vegetable, and horticultural employment from April to August 2019 and new COVID-19 cases and deaths within US counties in 2020. So Phil gave us this amazing overview looking at some of the national statistics. I am specifically focused on those changes within counties. And so that's why these results might look a little bit different from the description that Phil gave us. So why focus on FVH employment? I focus on FVH employment because it's seasonal and often labor intensive. So there were a few stories, such as in Yakima County, Washington, which is located in a major fruit and vegetable producing region of Washington state. It had the highest rate of COVID-19 infection on the West Coast in June 2020. Immokalee, Florida is a common stop for follow the crop workers who travel up the Eastern Shore. It reported 900 cases of COVID-19 between April and June 2020. So we could be concerned that given that there are some follow the crop workers in FVH production, that these workers could take an airborne disease like COVID-19 from one location to another. So those are some of the concerns, some of the reasons we look at FVH employment, or look at FVH employment specifically. Note that I look at data from April to August. I did extend the analysis to December as well, and found that results were robust to looking for month-to-month changes through December as well. But I cut it off in August here, just in case there might be concerns about colleges opening and maybe being correlated with some of those locations where there might be more FEH employment. So why should we care? Obviously, we're concerned about the health and safety of workers. And we're concerned about outbreaks of contagious viruses that could cause local farm labor shortages, possibly preventing the harvest of US commodities. And we would want to understand whether airborne viruses like COVID-19 could pose a threat to FEH labor supply, and consider how FEH producers might adjust to the additional risk and costs of production.
All right, thanks for that overview, Diane. So can you tell us a little bit more about the analysis you did, hopefully in some layman's terms for those of us that are not trained in economics, and then maybe just go over what you found in your study?
Sure, thanks. So at first I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that I used. So I was using data from the quarterly census of employment and wages. It provides sector-specific employment and wage data. It records these data for establishments that report to US unemployment insurance programs. So you can kind of get into some of the nuances of this. Some states include H-2A workers in that. California does, some states don't. I dropped all counties that don't have any FEH employment or that just didn't record FEH employment for various reasons. You know, if a county has very few employers, they might not report it in the QCW so that specific firms can't be identified. And another little adjustment that I make, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about FLCs here. As Phil mentioned, FLCs play an important role in agriculture in matching employers to workers, especially in difficult times where there might be labor shortages or just difficulty in finding workers. And so FLCs play an important role. So I actually impute the number of FLC employees per county using the county share of contract labor expenses in the state 2017 Census of Agriculture and the number of farm labor contractors and crew leaders in this state using the QCW. So why I do this is that the employer might be located in one county and workers might be working in various other counties. And so the number of workers attached to that employer in a county may not be very representative. So this is a way of sort of spreading out, figuring out where those workers are spreading out. So some nuances there, but just sort of an overview of the data they use. And then finally using the COVID-19 case and death data from the New York Times. So this is a look at FEH employment in July 2019, which was nationally the peak month of that FEH employment. Not surprisingly, California is major employers of FEH workers. So red being the most concentrated or the highest number of FEH workers. And looking at some of this temporal variation. So as I mentioned, I was looking at month-to-month changes in employment and COVID-19 cases. So here's just a look at the variation. You'll notice that the scale on each of these figures is a little bit different. So FEH, we have a very high variation peaking at over 500,000 workers nationally. If we look at other crops like grain and oilseed, this is peaking only at 40,000. So other crops, livestock is a little bit higher, peaking near 234,000. And then also look at post-harvest employees who might be working in, say, fruit packing sheds, only peaks around 85,000. So again, why we focus on FEH, there's so many FEH workers and lots of variation in FEH employment throughout the year. And then I will break this down by crop. So we have some of the crops in FEH and some of the variation. So what I actually do, and I'm not going to try to explain everything in this table, but I will explain the results themselves. But effectively, I'm looking at FEH employment and how changes in cases of COVID-19 within counties So I'm going to control for county fixed effects so that I'm only looking at that variation within the county. I also control for state by month fixed effects. So if a state passes some regulation that might reduce the spread of COVID-19, I'm controlling for anything that happens at the state month level. And then I also control for exposure to COVID-19 in April and interact that with month fixed effects. So what you'll notice here, what I want you to see in this table is just that these coefficients on FVH employment are statistically significant. Those stars mean that we are very confident that those are different from 0, and they are positive in every one of these specifications. I'm also controlling for some other employment sectors that might have seasonal variation employment. So what these findings actually mean, actually interpret them in words that make sense. 100 additional workers in the historical monthly FVH workforce were associated with between 2.27 and 4.54% more COVID-19 cases within counties. 15.78 to 18.65 additional COVID-19 cases per 100,000 individuals in the county workforce, and 0.21 to 0.34 deaths per 100,000. So all of these results are significant at the 1% level. So what I'm finding is there is a strong, statistically significant positive association between these changes in FVH employment and new COVID-19 cases and deaths within counties. Now, note that these findings do not imply that COVID-19 is necessarily spread more rapidly on farms or in agriculture-related activities. There are numerous characteristics that are correlated with seasonal farm employment that could be responsible for increased incidence of COVID-19. However, what I think these results really point to is that we should be concerned that agricultural employers do have to take into consideration the risks associated with spreading COVID-19 during their most labor-intensive seasons of production, and that's also going to have production costs.
Interesting. Thank you, Diane. So something I wanted to ask about, and maybe you weren't completely done discussing your results, but because you were just talking about this, I wanted to know how farms can actually respond to some of the potential risks from spread of COVID-19. And if I completely interrupted you, just continue, and then you can come back to my question.
That actually leads in really well, because the next finding that I wanted to point out, as Phil mentioned, farm labor contractors typically play an important role in helping producers adjust to changes in farm labor supply and just matching employers to workers. What I do find here when I break down the results by crops, and some of these data are pretty thin, so I have statistically significant coefficients in some places and not in others, but what I want to note here is that I do find this statistically significant positive coefficient on farm labor contractors in COVID-19 cases and deaths. So one of these sources that producers typically look to, farm labor contractors, are not immune to the risks that we just discussed with COVID-19. So question, is this a turning point? So farm labor contractors obviously is still a source of workers and matching employers to workers, but also may have some of the similar risks associated with COVID-19. So if the cost of implementing health and safety measures for seasonal workers is sufficiently high, agricultural producers might seek out alternative labor-saving technologies to reduce their dependence on labor, similar to what Phil concluded. So this is actually from the Rural Migration News. So I got these facts from Phil, but just examples of some of the measures, some of the policies to reduce COVID-19 spread in agriculture were costly to employers. So for example, employers in Washington state sued the Departments of Health and Labor and Industries, stating that it was impossible to comply with the emergency COVID-19 safety regulations, including restrictions on distance from a hospital emergency room. Employers in Oregon have requested to repeal emergency rules stipulating increased spacing between beds and farm worker housing. So some of these policies have been costly, and employers have even been bringing out that they cannot continue to comply with all of these safety measures. So another question similar to, as Phil mentioned, H2A is also an important source of farm labor. The share of H2A workers in the US has been growing rapidly in the 21st century. There are numerous job vacancies in restaurants and retail stores throughout the country right now. So does agriculture have to compete with these other labor opportunities to get workers from the domestic workforce? Some work that I've done with Marcelo Castillo, we do find that annual changes in unemployment rate within states, we find that the higher the unemployment rate is, and hence we would think there'd be less competition from some of these non-farm jobs, the higher the unemployment rate, the less we see H2A workers employed. So what our findings suggest is that when the labor market is tighter, when the unemployment rate is very low, farm employers tend to hire more H2A workers. So I would expect that in coming years, especially as we have these challenges related to worker safety, and we have difficulties in terms of job vacancies in other sectors, we'll probably see a greater dependence on H2A workers. In 2020, as Phil mentioned, total agricultural employment decreased, but H2A employment increased. And then finally, will farm workers tomorrow be workers who are working with robotics, with machinery? It might be much less labor intensive. So as Phil mentioned, these kinds of changes in mechanization have high upfront costs. They need to become more efficient to be cost effective for producers. And we will have to change the way that we train workers to make sure that they have the appropriate skills to work with the machinery that they will be using. But I suspect that in the future, we'll see more and more of harvesting fruits and vegetables using more mechanized technologies.
All right, thanks, Diane. Okay, so kind of just a last question to summarize, and I think you've sort of touched on this a little bit, but I just want to ask it to be, more clear. Is just like, what do you feel are the policy implications, if anything, from your research for dealing with the pandemic, and sort of just touching on whether the pandemic supply shortages for these fruit and vegetable operations, are these different or similar to other labor supply shocks that we've seen in the past?
Yes, so I think major policy implication is that when we have health risks associated with in-person work, obviously there will be higher cost producers of hiring workers. And so we're going to see greater pressure to mechanize harvest in these fruit and vegetable industries, similar to what Phil mentioned. These, and I hesitate to call them shortages because we don't have proof that there were labor shortages associated with COVID-19. I want to be clear that the findings I have do not identify a causal impact of farm employment on COVID-19. I just find a positive association, which I think would be somewhat alarming for producers who are thinking about how to reduce risk of any of their workers getting sick. So some of the fundamental differences between this and previous labor shortages, typically labor shortages in agriculture have been shown to be local labor shortages. It's a matter of getting workers where you need them at the time that you need them, not necessarily a national labor shortage. Right now we have a virus that is nationally and globally an issue and a concern, and increasing costs of keeping workers safe. And so there's a different mentality when we're thinking about something in the global context that is a shock to everyone around the world, as opposed to just locally finding workers and matching them to employers where they're needed. And I think that's one of the major differences and a change in mentality, not only in agriculture, but in many industries, in thinking about how do we think about production with a global shock like this pandemic.
Yeah, that's really interesting. All right, thank you so much, Diane. That was a great presentation, and I'm glad you were able to talk about your research today. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mehdi, who has been monitoring question and answer. So if anybody has questions for either of the panelists, go ahead and enter it in the Q&A box at the lower right-hand corner of the Zoom window.
Thank you, Brittany, and everyone. This was a great discussion, and we have plenty of time to for a Q&A. So anyone, if you have a question, please post it in the chat or the Q&A box. The first question goes for Dr. Martin, but also if Diane, if you have any answers for it, just jump in. So to what extent has COVID or regulation like rising minimum wage impacts farmers to switch from growing less labor intensive, to switch from more labor intensive to less labor intensive, higher value crops such as nuts and tree nuts?
Well, I mean, I think what Diane said and what I said, anything that raises labor costs and increases risks, farmers are trying to reduce their cost and reduce their risks. And so we've already seen, for example, the shrinking of raisin grape acreage. It was going on before COVID came along. It's in long-term decline. And as long as the market for almonds and other nuts remains robust and profitable, there's an encouragement of people to replace aging vineyards with tree nuts. And we've seen a long-term shrinking in the mature green tomato industry. We don't have much of an asparagus industry left. We don't have much of an apricot industry left. So all these things were happening anyway, but COVID speeded it up. And in the case of, for example, raspberries, that's a very labor-intensive crop. It's a fairly large employer, but there, I think it's as much the higher minimum wage and the overtime requirements that is shifting a lot of the production toward Mexico. I mean, whenever one is sort of thinking about changes in a particular commodity, it's never just one factor. It's a whole lot of different factors that combine. And when we look at Mexico, the idea is that a lot of land there, for better or worse, has not been farmed or heavily fertilized. So it's easier to get certified as organic often in Mexico than in the US. And with the demand for organic growing, and with Mexico having something of a latecomer advantage by going toward this controlled environmental agriculture, some commodities are shifting faster and some slower from the US to Mexico. But the overall driver is, not COVID per se, or not the minimum, it's rising labor costs and people thinking that there's no sudden end to the increase in labor costs. So if it's not, if we're going to have future pandemics, then there will be future costs associated with ensuring that workers are safe. And the big story for now, when we compare California with other states that produce fruits and vegetables, East Coast states, our minimum wage, overtime rules, and other regulations make the cost of labor significantly higher in a state like California than a state like Florida or Georgia. I think Georgia still has the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Next year, we will have a 2-to-1 gap between the minimum wage in California and the minimum wage in the 20-some states that use the federal minimum wage, almost a 2-to-1 gap. So I think, people who, for a long time in agriculture, California agriculture, there was the hope that there would somehow be an immigration reform that got rid of the adverse effect wage rate or reduced it, got rid of the requirement to provide housing for workers, et cetera. And I think that the combination of COVID and the fact that it does not appear that we'll get these big changes that would reduce and if anything, changes that are coming are more likely to increase labor cost rather than decrease labor cost, like with health precautions and stuff. So I think many more people are sort of saying, yes, we're on an upward trajectory of labor costs, whether it comes from regulation or health concerns or something else, or just simply lack of labor. And we may as well plan that way. And that means a lot more mechanization, in some cases, more imports.
Thank you.
I might just tag on to that. Phil already mentioned these things that kind of highlight, a lot of these labor intensive crops like orchards are very expensive to replace or change. So some of these changes, if producers are thinking about changing crops, that's not necessarily going to happen immediately, which means that there will also be a lot of pressure to mechanize and to find ways to reduce labor costs in each of these crops before a major change might occur. So as Phil mentioned, lots of factors involved.
Thank you very much. Can we both, if you don't mind, talk a little bit about the future mechanization and also imports from Mexico and some other countries? What that implies for U.S. consumers? Is that going to be they are going to be paying higher prices or same prices, or what are the implications for the consumers?
Diane, do you want to go first?
Sure, and Phil knows a lot more about the imports than I do, so he will tag on with lots of good information there. Sorry, I'm gathering my thoughts. Phil, go ahead. I'm going to have you go first.
Well, I don't think Americans are going to have to worry about lacks of fruit and vegetable. I mean, if you look at what's been happening is we spend something like, it's under 10% of our disposable income on food. And the last time I looked at the data, we spend more money on alcoholic beverages each year than we do on fresh fruits and vegetables for the typical household. So I don't think anyone has to worry very much about the lack of availability of fruits and vegetables. Some of them will get more expensive. People have proven to be willing to pay a premium for bagged salads, for example. We're willing to pay a premium for convenience. People are willing to pay a premium for little cherry tomatoes that are nicely packaged. So overall, the whole idea that farm labor costs are somehow going to make it hard to afford to eat. It's hard to afford to eat, it's not because of high farm labor costs. There are other things, like you don't have an income or something like that. There are people who are food insecure, but it's not the from the farm labor picture. I think that it would be, it's not surprising that very labor intensive commodities, which are difficult to mechanize in the US, shift to lower cost countries. I mean, green onions are a good example. It takes a lot of labor to produce and put in band up the little green onion packages, and most of them are imported from Mexico. Green asparagus, the same story. There was a lot of efforts to try to mechanize it. In the end, most of it now comes from Peru and Mexico. And so that's kind of what happened with garments. That's what happened with a lot of electronics, that things that once were produced in the US do shift abroad. There are cases in which the US has some unique comparative advantage. We are a net exporter of fresh apples. Washington is a great place apparently to grow fresh apples, lots of different varieties and that sort of. The coast of California is a good place to grow fresh strawberries in the summer. So there are many areas or many commodities in areas where the United States is uniquely suited. In those areas, I think there will be an effort to achieve a labor-saving mechanization. In some cases, like let's say Washington apples, I think there will be a rising dependence on H-2A workers and mechanical aids. They have platforms to replace ladders, et cetera. And then that might be a bridge to full mechanization because there's a lot of work going on. But as Diane was saying, you have to replant the orchards and make instead of a round tree, make it a two-dimensional, like a vineyard kind of tree so that the machine can more easily find the apple. And in strawberries, you put conveyor belts in front of workers so they don't have to walk as much, and that raises their productivity. And there are machines that are being developed. So the direction of change is clear. It's toward more labor-saving mechanization, more imports in some commodities. The speed of getting there is going to vary a lot. It's going to depend on how much is invested in the current system. What's the age structure of the growers? What's the availability of capital to tear something down before it's used its full useful life and start replacing it? So it's much easier to predict the direction of change than it is to predict the exact speed or how it will play out.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just add that this global competition is also what drives the innovation in a lot of these labor-saving technologies. Obviously, the United States does not have a comparative advantage in labor-intensive production. However, a lot of consumers would be willing to pay a premium to get fresh fruits and vegetables that were grown locally. So we might see some consumers paying premiums for locally grown fruits and vegetables. I don't think that fruit and vegetable production will disappear entirely from the United States, but we probably will see more imports as well. I also, can chat with friends who talk about how they prefer locally grown strawberries from the United States, I should say, but they're also, don't have a tendency to look at those labels. You go to Costco, you find a lot of strawberries from Mexico. So even though a lot of consumers, they say that they have a preference for strawberries grown in the United States, they might be buying strawberries from Mexico without even realizing it. However, all of that global pressure, that competition, because we are in a global market, is really going to drive some of these innovations in more labor-saving technologies. I might also add that, we have a lot of production shifting to Mexico, where the wages are significantly lower than in the United States. Mexico is also expanding its industrial production, and we're seeing more workers who are transitioning from agriculture to non-agricultural sectors. And so we're going to see similar pressure gradually occurring in Mexico and some of these regions where we import fruits from as well. And so there's going to be pressure globally for some of these mechanized technologies.
Thank you. And that's really gets us to the next two questions. One is, and this person I was wondering if there is a reliable data on the cost of implementing robotics machinery, if the cost is declining or manufacturers charging a premium due to the lack of competition in specialized farm robotics. And then a related question is that, to your answer, Dan, is that do consumer desire to buy local food significantly affect the market, which I think you partially answered that already.
I mean, these are hard questions. People machines get adopted when the cost of, when machine costs are lower than labor cost. I mean, it's really a pretty simple equation. And there's a lot of different approaches to mechanization. And it's sometimes hard to tell what the winning, strategy is going to wind up being. So for example, if you look at the big success of UC Davis on the processing tomato harvester, it took a decade to mechanize the processing tomato harvest from 1961 to about 69. But if you were to buy the first machine that came out of Davis, that was a loser. It could not separate the tomatoes from this. You would have wasted a lot of money on a machine that 2 years later, was not being used. So you usually hear stories about engineers overpromise and underdeliver, because once the machine gets out in the field, then you face a lot of things that are not the same as it is in the laboratory. So the promise of robotics is there. There's a lot of venture capital going into various things, but one of the things that one of the issues in fruits and vegetables is that the technical problems are difficult and the market is often small. I'll give you a concrete example. There are 7 major cantaloupe growers in California, and we produce a huge share of the nation's cantaloupes. And there is a prototype machine. If that were to become successful, in order to harvest all the acreage, you would need maybe 30 or maybe 40 of the machines. Now, suppose your profit margin is 1,000%. You're still never going to become Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos making cantaloupe machines. It's a technically hard problem and a limited market. And it's very important to those growers and those workers who are there. But in many cases, the size of the market limits the amount of capital that's going to go in. So apples are the exception. It's the largest labor user in the United States, almost 300,000 acres. But when you get to commodities that only have 10 or 15,000 acres, no matter how good your technology is, the market, you're not going to sell that many machines. That's why when the Blue River, the idea of using whatever it was, flames or fertilizer to get rid of weeds or get rid of extra plants. I mean, when John Deere bought it, they bought it because you can apply that same thinning and weeding technology to a whole lot of acres. So the market is much bigger. Whereas if you develop a machine that successfully harvests a small acreage crop, it becomes a much more limited thing. And so what I think the people that I know who work in this business say, the easy automation things have already been more or less solved. I mean, they're easy, so the hard ones that are left often run into this issue of they're technically hard problems, and there's limited markets, even if you wind up being successful. On local, I don't know, I've been surprised by how much venture capital is going into controlled environment agriculture and how they are moving from leafy greens, which have a really short growing season and turnaround, to they're talking about now trying to grow strawberries in controlled environments. So you have local, organic controlled environment strawberries. I don't know what the market will be. I guess if you look at organics, I'm not sure we might be up to 10% organic in some particular commodities, but it's more likely to be, my guess is slower rather than quick.
Thank you. Dan, do you want to?
Yeah. And I might just add that, as Phil mentioned, these are very technical problems in terms of developing robotic machines to harvest our fruits and vegetables. So, for example, they've been trying to develop a couple different engineers have been working separately to try to develop a machine to robotically harvest strawberries for over a decade, and it's not yet commercially available. It's been getting much closer. And so when I talked to some of the engineers like at UC Davis who are working on problems like this, trying to develop machines to robotically harvest apples and pears, they have a big question of how cheap does this technology have to be for it to be viable, because as they're developing it, obviously it's very expensive. So this is a long process of development and then adoption. And so kind of reiterating, as Phil mentioned, these are difficult questions and they're not obvious answers. To make the technology viable, it has to get down to a certain cost that producers would even consider purchasing it.
Perfect. Thank you both. And here's a question. It says, what has California agriculture employers changed to actively adjust for the next harvest season? In other words, what can they feasibly change to prepare for the next season? Is the wage adjustment the only immediate actions, since mechanization will take time to implement? And how are farmers preparing if another severe COVID wave hits their farms?
I mean, I don't know. These are good questions, but you know, the trouble with looking at data is it comes from the past. It's hard to get data from the future.
Yes.
And so it's really hard to say, but it is true that vegetable acreage, which is much more it's easier to adjust, that has been shrinking in some commodities, down in some, up in others. And you know, I think that the most immediate change was to increase the number of H-2A workers. I mean, that is, an employer initiates that process by asking the government to certify their need for the workers. And that's what a lot of more employers did in 2021 than they had done in 2020 or 2019. And all indications are that the program will continue expanding in the next several years. So I would think that the number one adjustment to whether it's rising minimum wages or fears of another COVID outbreak or something, probably the single biggest change has probably been more H-2A workers. I think there have been more mechanical aids to make workers more productive, whether it's US workers or H-2A workers. But I think the mechanization and the imports, those are more longer term things that you would expect to play out over 5 years or 10 years, as opposed to just from one year to the next.
Thank you. Unless if there's a question from other panelists for the speakers, I'm going to turn it to Ellen to finish up.
Did you see the one just came into the Q&A? Did you see that one?
Oh yeah, there is a new question. Okay, I see. Yes, thanks. Okay. So here's a little bit long question. Diane and Phil, could you please elaborate on your point about how labor shortages or tightness in the labor market is local, and how this point fits within the increasing use of H-2A labor and increasing AWERAs? Does this trend? Yes.
Yeah, good question. Sorry, did I cut you off there?
No, yeah, we can take part. I think it's multiple questions. Does this trend point to something that we can call a labor shortage in domestic, unauthorized and authorized workers in agriculture, or just tidying of the labor market? Are employees weighing the cost and benefits of employing domestic workers or H-2A workers?
Yeah, so defining a labor shortage is always a little bit tricky, because if you have a labor shortage, why don't you just increase the wage? And then economic theory would predict that more workers would come as the wage rises. So, however, agriculture is a little bit unique in that we have this uncertainty in the timing of harvest and how many workers will be needed and when they will be needed. And so, because workers are often migratory, we often have these local labor shortages where, say, the harvest was a little bit earlier than I anticipated, and I don't have workers scheduled to arrive for another couple weeks. Or maybe the harvest was bigger than I anticipated, and there are not enough workers within my local region to harvest my crop. And so generally, economists agree that there are these local labor shortages that occur in these agricultural markets. Mm-hmm. A few phenomenon in the past couple decades have exacerbated this. Farm workers tend to be less migratory than they were. So follow the crop migration used to be very common. The last National Agricultural Workers Survey, 2016, I think follow the crop workers were only 8% of the crop workforce. And so the migration has been decreasing. Obviously, if workers are less migratory, they're staying in one place, we're going to have more difficulty, more friction getting them from one farm to another, from one region to another. So that's why we tend to have these local labor shortages. Now, H-2A can help reduce some of these shortages because H-2A workers are contracted. So as an employer, I have to anticipate in head how many workers I want to employ and when I want to employ them. And so I'd be bringing workers from abroad to work on my farm for a specified period of time. And so from the employer perspective, I reduce the risk that I will have a labor shortage, but I also might incur additional costs. Maybe I employ those workers for a longer period than I actually need them. Maybe I have them come a week or two before I actually need them because I didn't actually know when peak harvest would be. So there might be some cost in that end. Obviously the AEWR, to the extent that that might be higher than local farm wages, I might have to pay a higher wage, have to provide housing. But at the same time, because we do see this tightening of farm labor supply overall, less migratory, Mexicans are transitioning out of farm work, just more difficult to find local farm workers. We're finding that farm employers are also offering many more benefits than they used to. So even apart from H-2A, some farmers are even providing housing, providing schooling for workers' children and childcare to try to attract more workers to their farms. So I would agree with Phil that I think H-2A is going to continue to expand so that employers have greater certainty of when workers will be there. And because we see some of these rising costs of labor in the domestic labor market, H-2A becomes more attractive, more viable compared to the options of hiring workers locally. Phil, you might have something to add to that.
No, I think that's fine. I mean, I think I think the fact is we have a biological production process, and a whole lot of things from climate change to everything else is making it a little less predictable. And we don't have the housewives and students on standby or the follow the crop migrants the way we did 50 years ago. So it really does become an issue of increasing the uncertainty of exactly when the peak demand is going to wind up being. The H-2A basically is labor insurance. And because the employer has to pay only 3/4 of the hours that they contract for, and you would have to have a terrible hailstorm or something for that not to happen. So that's why H-2As become that insurance package for biological uncertainties.
Thank you. And just a follow-up question. You mentioned that H-2A labor or workers are tend to be younger. Are they also tend to be higher skills or like higher education, or do you have any data on that one too?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have limited data on H-2As, but the education levels in Mexico are rising. So the unauthorized workers who are older, on average, have fewer years of schooling than the younger H-2A workers who are coming now. It's about a year difference. So it runs sort of 8 years versus 7, more or less. I mean, but once again, the data are fairly limited, especially on the H-2As.
Perfect. Thank you very much for a great discussion. I will turn it to Ellen to finish up the webinar. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mehdi, and thank you again, Phil and Diane. That was great. I just want to say sort of a save the date for the next one. Our next ARI discussions will be on Tuesday, December 7th at the same time from 10 to 11:15 a.m. You can always visit our website at aridiscussions.ucdavis.edu for more information about upcoming webinars, to register for the webinars, and if you'd like to subscribe to our mailing list so that you can get reminders about upcoming events. So thank you again so much for all coming this morning, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.